The elevator doors opened onto the 43rd floor, and the first thing Gordon Carter noticed was how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, the other kind, the kind that exists when people know something is happening and have agreed, without speaking, not to acknowledge it. The receptionist at the curved oak desk looked up when he stepped out, held her gaze on him for exactly 2 seconds, and looked back down. The woman near the window with a coffee cup in her hand turned slightly away. A man in a gray blazer who had been walking toward the elevator changed his path without breaking stride. Gordon had spent 31 years reading rooms. This one was not difficult. He adjusted the strap of his bag on his shoulder and walked toward the reception desk. The carpet was the color of slate, and his footsteps made no sound at all. "Gordon Carter," he said. "I have an appointment with Hartwell Group, 10 o'clock. The receptionist, her name tag said Simone, no last name, typed something without looking at him. "They're expecting you in the Rideau boardroom. Down the hall, second left, last door." He thanked her. She was already looking at her screen. The hallway was lined with framed photographs of buildings, office towers, mostly. A few civic structures. Each one had a small brass plaque beneath it with a year and a city. Vancouver, 2009. Halifax, 2014. Calgary, 2018. The photographs were the kind that cost money to produce and said nothing about the people who had taken them. Gordon stopped at the last door on the left. Through the narrow window beside it, he could see 4 people already seated at the long table. 3 men and a woman, all of them with folders open and water glasses in front of them. None of them were looking at the door. He had done this before. Not this room, not these people, but the shape of it. He knew the shape of it. He opened the door and went in. What had brought Gordon Carter to the 43rd floor of the Hartwell Group building on a Tuesday morning in October was not ambition, exactly. It was closer to necessity, the specific kind that appears when a man has spent 3 years building something careful and good, and then finds himself standing at the edge of a decision he did not see coming. He was 47 years old. He had a daughter named Penny, who was 11, and thought his taste in music was embarrassing and kept a list of jokes she wanted to tell him. He had a mortgage on a house in Canada that needed a new roof by spring. He had a firm, Carter Structural Consulting, that he had built from a one-desk operation into a team of 6, and which had, over the last 18 months, quietly run into the kind of trouble that small firms run into when they grow faster than their contracts can sustain. He did not talk about the trouble with anyone except his accountant, a careful woman named Helen Rafferty, who had laid the numbers out for him in September with the particular directness of someone who has learned that clarity is kinder than hesitation. The Hartwell Group contract would not solve everything, but it would solve enough that the rest became manageable. That was the entirety of the calculation, and Gordon had made it clearly and without flinching, and then he had called to confirm his appointment and told Penny he had a meeting downtown, and she had said, without looking up from her homework, "Is it the big one?" He had said, "Maybe." She had said, "Okay, good luck, Dad." He had stood in the kitchen for a moment after that, not moving, just holding that sentence. The 4 people in the Rideau boardroom introduced themselves in the way that people do when they already know what they think of you, and the introduction is procedural. There was a man named Douglas Mercer, who had the title of Director of Infrastructure, and the manner of someone who had held that title long enough to have stopped finding it interesting. Beside him sat a woman named Claudette Favreau from Legal, who had a yellow legal pad and a mechanical pencil, and who wrote things down at intervals that did not correspond to anything Gordon could identify. Across from them, a younger man named Seth Pollock, from Project Development, who asked clarifying questions in a tone that suggested he was not looking for clarification. And at the head of the table, though he sat slightly back from it, as though he had not yet decided how much of the meeting to claim, was a man Gordon had not been told to expect. His name, Gordon would learn later, was Warren Ashby. He was the founder and chief executive of Hartwell Group, and he was not, by most accounts, someone who attended preliminary consultations. But he was here. He had a cup of coffee in front of him that he hadn't touched, and his eyes moved steadily around the room the way eyes do when the person's behind them is taking inventory. Gordon noticed him and then set that information aside. He had other things to attend to. The meeting opened with Mercer outlining the scope of the Rideau South development, a mixed-use project that would break ground the following March, a 12-story structure with retail on the ground floor, office space above, and a residential tower attached. Structural consultation was required from pre-design through to occupancy, with specific emphasis on foundation work given the site's proximity to the old rail corridor. Gordon listened without interrupting. He had reviewed the project documents twice, and he had walked the site himself on a Sunday afternoon in September, boots in the mud, taking photographs with his phone and making notes in a small spiral notebook he kept in his coat pocket. He knew what was in those documents and what wasn't. When Mercer finished, he looked at Gordon with the particular expectancy of a man who has said his piece and now wants to see what the other person does with it. "Before I respond," Gordon said, "I want to ask about the subsurface report, the one filed in 2021. There was a brief silence. "The report was updated," Pollock said. "I know. I read the update. My question is about a discrepancy between page 14 of the original and the corresponding section of the update. The original flags a pocket of relic fill material running east to west along the southern boundary. The update describes the same area differently and doesn't address the original flag directly." Claudette Favreau wrote something down. "That discrepancy," Gordon said, "would need to be resolved before foundation design could begin. Not during it. Before." Mercer shifted in his chair. "Our geotechnical firm has signed off on the current report. I understand that. I'm not suggesting they made an error. I'm suggesting that if the discrepancy isn't reconciled, any structural consultation I provide could be built on assumptions that later turn out not to hold. That's a risk for the project. It's also a risk for my firm." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, through the window, the Ottawa skyline sat in flat October light. "You're raising this now," Pollock said. "It was not a question. Yes, why not in your written proposal?" Gordon looked at him. "Because I thought it was the kind of thing that should be said out loud." The meeting ran another 40 minutes. The questions from Pollock grew less pointed and more genuine, which Gordon registered as a shift in the room's temperature. Mercer moved from assessment mode to something closer to conversation. Favreau kept writing at the same intervals that still made no sense to Gordon, but her expression had changed slightly. Less guarded, maybe. Ashby said nothing. He sat at the head of the table and listened and kept his hands flat on the surface and watched. At the end of the scheduled time, Mercer said they would be in touch by end of week. He said it the way people say it when the decision is not yet made. Gordon thanked them for their time. He shook hands with Mercer and Favreau and Pollock. He did not shake hands with Ashby because Ashby had not moved toward the table's edge, and Gordon did not reach for a hand that had not been offered. He picked up his bag and left. In the hallway, he walked back past the photographs of buildings, Vancouver, Halifax, Calgary, and pressed the elevator button and waited. The carpet absorbed his footsteps. The receptionist named Simone did not look up. The woman by the window with the coffee cup was gone. The elevator arrived. Gordon stepped inside. The doors closed. He stood facing the polished metal of the interior wall and thought in a plain and measured way about what had just happened. He thought about the subsurface question and whether he had raised it too early or at exactly the right moment. He thought about Pollock's tone when it changed. He thought about Mercer's eyes. He thought about Penny at school right now, probably in math class, probably doodling in the margin of her notebook. The elevator opened on the lobby. He walked through it. All glass and polished stone and corporate art on the walls, the kind of lobby that costs a great deal to feel like it costs nothing, and pushed through the revolving door into the October air. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The air was cold and clean and smelled faintly of rain that had already passed. He reached into his coat pocket and found his notebook and stood there in the ordinary way of a man who has done what he came to do and is now thinking about what comes next. That was when he heard the door. The revolving door pushed out again behind him, and he heard footsteps, quick, purposeful, the sound of someone who had made a decision and was not reconsidering it, and then a voice said, "Mr. Carter." He turned around. It was Warren Ashby. He had his coat on. He'd had time to grab his coat, but his collar was open and his lanyard badge was still around his neck, which told Gordon he hadn't planned to come outside and had come anyway. "I thought you were still upstairs," Gordon said. "I was," Ashby said. And then I wasn't. He stopped 2 feet away. He was maybe 60, maybe a bit less, with the kind of build that suggested he had worked physically in earlier parts of his life and still carried that in his posture. He looked at Gordon the way he had looked at him throughout the meeting, direct, steady, taking inventory. "That question you raised," Ashby said. "About the subsurface report, yes. How long have you been sitting on that?" Gordon considered the question. "Since September. I walked the site." Ashby was quiet for a moment. A city bus went past on the street behind him, and a cyclist cut through the crosswalk, and the ordinary sounds of a Tuesday morning in downtown Ottawa kept moving around them as though nothing had paused. "Why raise it in the meeting?" Ashby said. Most people in your position would have flagged it after, in a follow-up email, once they had the contract. Gordon looked at him. The answer was not complicated, but it was also not short, so he took a moment to decide which version of it was accurate. Because if I flag it after, he said, I'm already building on a problem I knew about. And if the project runs into trouble 6 months from now, I've been complicit in that from the beginning. He paused. That's not how I do the work. Ashby put his hands in his coat pockets. He looked at the building across the street for a moment and then looked back. We've been through 3 structural firms on this project, he said. 2 of them told us what we wanted to hear. 1 of them told us things that were technically accurate and practically useless. What you did in that room, I haven't seen that before. Gordon didn't say anything. I'm not in the habit of running after people in parking lots, Ashby said. This is a sidewalk, Gordon said. Something in Ashby's expression shifted, not quite a smile, but the thing that happens just before one. No, he said. It is. He looked at Gordon with the same steadiness he'd had in the boardroom. I want to make you an offer, he said. Not just the Rideau South consultation. We have 7 projects in various stages of development across Ontario and Quebec. I want your firm involved from the beginning, not as a subcontractor, as a structural partner. Gordon was quiet. The October wind moved through the gap between the buildings. That's a significant proposition, he said. Yes, Ashby said. It is. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. Did you make this decision before you left the boardroom or after? Ashby considered that. During, he said. When you answered Pollock's question about why you didn't include the discrepancy in your written proposal. Because I thought it was the kind of thing that should be said out loud. That's the answer, Ashby said. That's exactly the answer. We build structures that people live and work inside. That's not abstract. That's concrete in every sense of the word. And I've spent 25 years watching people treat it as though it were negotiable. He paused. You didn't treat it as negotiable. Gordon looked at the building behind Ashby. The one with the 43rd floor, the slate carpet, the photographs of cities. He thought about Helen Rafferty and her numbers laid out in September. He thought about a new roof in spring. He thought about Penny at her desk saying, "Good luck, Dad," without looking up, because she had already decided he would be fine. I'd need to review the project documents, Gordon said. All 7. And I'd need to walk every site before we discuss terms. Of course, Ashby said. And if I find other discrepancies, then you raise them, Ashby said. Out loud. In the room. He said it without hesitation, as though it were already a condition of the arrangement and had been from the moment he came through the revolving door. Gordon looked at him for a moment. All right, he said. They shook hands on the sidewalk in the October morning, with the city moving around them. The handshake was brief and firm and carried the particular quality of 2 people who have already understood something about each other and are only now making it official. Ashby said he would have the documents sent over by end of day. Gordon said he'd have feedback within the week. Ashby nodded and turned and went back through the revolving door, and Gordon watched him go. The open collar, the lanyard badge, the purposeful stride of a man who had done what he came to do and was already thinking about what comes next. Gordon stood on the sidewalk for another minute. He took out his notebook and wrote the date and 4 words, 7 projects, structural partner. Then he put the notebook back in his pocket and pulled out his phone and found Penny's school number and stopped before dialing. She was in class. He would tell her when she got home. He thought about what he would say. He hadn't worked that out yet. He thought he might just say, the big one, that it was the big one. And she would probably nod in that way she had, not surprised, just registered, the way she registered most things that confirmed what she had already, quietly, suspected. And then she would tell him one of her jokes, the one she had been keeping on her list, and he would try to understand why it was funny, and she would explain it to him with the patient tolerance of an 11-year-old who loves someone whose taste in music is embarrassing, and the kitchen would be warm, and outside the October dark would be doing what it does. He walked to his car. The roof in Canada still needed to be replaced by spring. Now at least he knew that it would be.